This is Season 3, Episode 2 of the Faith Over Breakfast podcast. Oh, you want to intro this?
Yeah, hey, welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name's Andy Littleton. I'm with Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona, which frequently gets called the Mission Church, and I just want to clarify.
Mission.
I just want to clarify right now.
It's Mission Church.
There's no the, just Mission Church.
Mission Church.
And I'm sitting across from my buddy Eric, who is from
The
Village Church. In,
Right, the
Tucson,
Village
Not
Church.
Village, but the Village
Church.
And we had a little bit shorter conversation than some of our other ones, so you're welcome. It was on micro churches, and it's basically if you've got if you're interested in church theory, or if you're not and you want to get in the brains of some people who have thought about the different theories on how churches should be set up and done, we work through that a little bit through the lens of a new movement called micro church that I just did some learning about.
Yeah, and you define it. So for those of you who feel like you don't have no idea what that is, he does a good job of telling us what it is. This is interesting that this is season 1 or season 3 episode 1. So we had like a real exciting
home dinger for season 3 episode 1. No, actually, gosh. I think it was interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
So anyway, thanks for tuning in and enjoy.
Hey.
Hey.
Here we are, like almost making out. We're so close on the table.
Okay.
We could touch hands.
There's like 2 feet between our faces,
yeah,
just to
good.
be clear. But it feels very like a special moment we're about to have, even though I just showed up.
You did. I'm going to shut the door.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We got to shut the door. It's good to be here. I think we should just start again.
All right, let's do that. Just cut that other crap. All right, there we are. Hey, how you doing, Andy?
Hey, I'm doing well, man. Good to be here. I just went on a stroll with one of my elders from the church around the neighborhood, and life is good.
Here you are.
Yeah.
About to talk about micro churches, I heard.
Yeah. So I just got Nick and I went to a gathering in a very, very beautiful location. I thought this was a little bit irony. We talked about micro churches, and the venue was a castle.
Oh, wow. In California or Colorado?
In Colorado.
Did you go to the Glen Eyrie?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It was beautiful, and I didn't really know what we were getting into.
Have you ever been?
No.
I have not either, but my parents and lots of my friends have, and so I hear about it.
Yeah, it was a beautiful place. The wildlife was incredible. The founder of Colorado Springs built his home there, and basically built a Victorian castle, manor house sort of deal, and it's right up next to the Garden of the Gods. But it was funny. It was just a little ironic to talk about micro churches and these small, nimble little organizations at this huge castle owned by a Christian organization.
Right.
It was, but then again, it kind of invited the question of, do we always need to be micro? Does everything need to be micro? Because sometimes
things need to be big.
Sometimes it's nice to have a beautiful retreat center.
It is.
And you can't do that with a church of 6 people.
Yeah, well, and so we should start out, saying that I'm Eric. Yeah. Even though we're going to say it earlier.
This is the second.
But you're
intro.
Andy.
I am.
That's at least me. People should know that.
Yeah. Well, why don't I? You just let us. You just gave me the feedback that we haven't always unpacked the article that we're talking about or something like that. So let me unpack my.
Why don't you unpack it, and then I'll tell you the parts that I understand if you don't. Say those.
So as a part of this discussion, this is a little bit of a newer discussion, and it dawned on me while I was there, and this probably means this podcast will never reach, Jordan Peterson podcast first week status, but the only people that are having this kind of conversation are entrenched in church stuff.
Right. So if you're entrenched in church stuff, this is the podcast for you.
Exactly.
This is it.
In
fact, we're going to put it in parentheses. Entrenched in Church, the podcast for you.
Or if you want to know what entrenched in church people are thinking, which I know you do.
Yeah, people are dying to hear it.
Then here it is. So Yeah, essentially there's been some movements. So throughout history, but recently there was kind of the seeker-sensitive movement, and these were the mega churches, so big churches that tried to be all things to all people and provide every service and every single thing you could want, and all the amenities, and kind of be like a mall, like a shopping mall, like where you could come and you could eat and you could find entertainment, and you could find everything you were looking for. One-stop shop. A church would just do it all, and do it all with absolute excellence.
Yes.
And so then the pendulum swings, right? And so people are feeling disconnected with that, and some folks went to small churches, but some people went all the way to home churches, and home churches were usually disconnected from any kind of broader organization. They, as their name insinuates, just meet in homes. And the critique, I think, with the home churches was that they were a little bit insular. They because they weren't connected to the broader church, they could be just disconnected in general. A lot of them didn't stick. They weren't able to do things at much high capacity. They weren't really able to serve much together because their resource pool is really small. But I think, and the biggest thing is they were just disconnected. And then kind of a middle ground back from that was churches. The large churches started having small groups to make sure that they could provide smaller community. And then some churches, newer churches, started things called missional communities. And these were like a small group that wasn't just about community and looking after itself, but a small group that was about getting things done and finding God's mission in the world and getting it done together. So, and then there have been church planting networks in which a group will get together and plant all kinds of middle-sized churches, and a lot of those have had missional communities or small groups.
Right.
Microchurch is a new idea, so it's
depending on who you talk to.
Yes, of course, but it is, because it has nuances all its own. It's not just small church.
Right.
So microchurch is this idea of the network, like a small network in a way. There was a book that we read called The Underground Church, and this church in Tampa is one that's being kind of touted as like a microchurch example, a good example of it. It's been around for about 10 years, and they have a network that is kind of has elders, and it's kind of like a church body, and then they have what would have been like missional communities, except they call them churches. And so some of them have 4 people, some of them have 50 people, but they make them independent churches, and then the leader of those small churches are all a part of the network and are elders together within that network. So they're organized around mission, and community happens through mission. They try to go out there and get stuff done, but they call themselves churches, each little tiny one. So even if it's, like I said, 3 or 4 people. So, we were discussing that and just things related to that and our churches and what we thought we could, what we could learn from this movement. And, that's what I just did for a few days, beginning last week. Yeah, it was interesting. So anyway, I thought if you and me were meeting for breakfast, which is the concept of this podcast,
I would be, how is your thing? And then we would go.
And then we would go into this. So
yeah.
So now let's do that. Now that we've given some backstory, now let's have our real breakfast.
Yeah. Well, let me throw a few things in on that, and then we can go discuss.
Yeah.
So first, at least my understanding of the microchurch goes back to a book that I read a long time ago. The cover says "Emerging Church."
Emerging Church was
this is the 70s. Before the Emerging Church.
Okay.
And it basically describes what a lot of people would call like the simple church or the microchurch or the missional church. Yes, microchurch seems to be a more refined thing.
Right.
There are a couple movements like Soma churches, Salt churches. who do these things.
Assault churches?
Assault. They assault you. The assault churches. Beware of the assault churches.
I was like, whoa.
They just take
That's an unfortunate.
They just throw salt on you as soon as you come in. They assault you with salt.
They needed a bigger group to help discern that one wasn't a good idea.
My thing about the micro churches, and I hadn't heard of the name as much, but the idea is, I mean, it's kind of taking a lot of these streams, like simple church, small church, missional church, and connectedness, and trying to, it's trying to take the best of those and put them all together.
I think it is. Yeah, that's kind of what I gathered, was that there were, through a lot of these other movements, things have been learned, and so being too small and disconnected isn't good, and so it's creating a network, but then small is more nimble, and people have a stronger affinity within something that's small. And
sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, what did you think? Like, what were the basic principles that you were like, yeah, I could take these away, and maybe we can talk about a critique of the micro church and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I will say that I don't think any of us there were doing micro church the way that this book described it, per se. And so that needs to be said. So all of us who are processing it, we were doing something that was smaller and more nimble, I think, but none of us were doing quite what they had said. There was one guy who was a part of a home church movement, but it wasn't like I wouldn't say it was like a microchurch in that each church was based around a specific missional goal. At least that wasn't my read. And then there were others of us, like Nick and I, who have, in a way, like more just a traditional church that's just not big, and has more of a missional emphasis.
Yeah, well, let's unpack that for a minute, because please. I think a lot of people, just the word missional, it's weird because it gets thrown around a lot, and people say, I want to be a missional church. Yeah. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you're like, what does that mean?
Sure.
If absolutely. You are a follower of Jesus, you're like, I don't know what that means. Yeah. You hear a different definition. So here's some of the definitions I hear. One, a missional church is one that goes out and serves. Mm-hmm. So collectively, a group of people go and they do something that is being the hands and feet of Jesus.
Right.
They do something very tangible, feeding the poor, taking care of there's so many, taking care of the environment, advocating for migrants. These are missional actions in their mind.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's where I've been with it. I mean, that's when we named our church. The idea was we just wanted to be a church that was involved, hands-on, that we didn't just talk about it, we did stuff.
So with the other one, or just the other one is kind of a more traditional mode, that it's a small group of people going to complete, Matthew 28. We're going to go make disciples, and we're going to bring people into the kingdom, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right.
Like that's missional to them. A group that can go in and do it quickly, doesn't have to have a lot of programs, can do it very organically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing I was hearing over this weekend that was interesting to me, it was a nuance that I'm sure if I were, just chilling in church organizing circles all the time, I would have known this, but I don't. But it was this idea of being organized around mission primarily, versus being organized maybe more around community or more around, knowledge and learning.
Right.
And it was interesting. There was one discussion I was having we kind of had a breakout little brainstorming session with our table group. And I thought of the Great Commission, and I thought, okay, so, is there something to the order that Jesus put it in where he said, go and make disciples, teaching them everything that I've, commanded. And I thought, I think the way that I've gone about church, and most of us have, is that we've gone, okay, we're going to teach them everything. In so doing, we're going to be able to declare that they are a disciple, and then we will send people out once they're done.
Right.
And Jesus, reversed the order. He told people, now these were his disciples who'd walked with him, but they clearly, early in their ministry, they were walking with him, they were doing ministry with him, but they didn't have it all figured out, and there were a lot of things they hadn't learned yet. And so I just began to wonder. I wonder if there is something to inviting people into some form of a go, and then the discipling and the teaching happens through the going, which is kind of what this book suggested, that it was saying that the people weren't lacking in community. They were growing in their faith, but the thing that kept them moving and engaged was that they had a common mission, that they had something to do, that they had something they believed in, that they were empowered to go and get done, whether it was specifically evangelistic or if it was more service-oriented first. And but yeah, these folks were saying the other stuff it happened because they were engaged in being able to do something that they really felt called to do. And I thought, yeah, I wonder how many people would stick more if they weren't just kind of put in a learning lab for years before they were sent. But then again, that kind of scares me a little bit.
Yeah,
to
a little
send
bit.
people out who aren't, in my mind, equipped.
Right. Well, I always thought Matthew 28, and I know that you can say this in the Greek, it's not just go. So I think when we think of go, we think of like a green
Just
light
activate,
and you
sure.
go. No, it's as you are going, make disciples.
Yeah.
So as you, and in some ways, yes, you have a destination that your life should never be insular, but it's as you're going in your life, make disciples and teach them. So it's like your life is always an act of teaching.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's not like this is some an unfortunate thing that we've done is we've gone, that means we have a class from time to time.
Right. To teach people.
Right.
And so and the people who really work well with that jump into it and fit. Like there are people who like to sit under teaching and learn and then go do stuff. Like that's their way of learning. That actually works pretty well for them.
Yeah, and there are definitely a lot of different ways to, and then there are other people that I tend to engage with a lot. Like there's a guy in our wood shop who would say like, I can't just go and be told about this. The only way I'm going to learn how to make a piece of furniture is to make it with somebody and to be hands-on and to learn it that way. And then I'll be great at it, but I can't. You just set me in a room and tell me. It's not going to stick. And I'm sure that's also true.
Sure.
Of following Jesus, that there are probably folks who are more into like, I'll read the book, I'll read another book, I'll sit, under the teaching and then it'll sink in. And there are other people who are probably kind of saying, that's not working for me. Can we walk together? And maybe the micro church movement is important because of the imbalance.
Yes.
Right. Like maybe it's not like the other churches can't be or shouldn't be, but it's the imbalance of there are less places where people can learn Christianity by walking with than there are places where people have to just sit under lecture. Right.
Well, I wonder, like, here's my critique of micro church, emergent church, attractional church, all these churches is when you listen to the people who are proponents of them, they talk as if this is the thing that will bring revival into this.
Yeah,
and I know at the micro church, they're looking around at Cuba and China and South America and seeing the home church movement and this sort of micro church movement explode. And they're saying, well, why can't that? It needs to happen here in the U.S. And it's also
they're pointing to the early church, which most of these have, by the way. Like
everybody,
but
you can get Acts chapter 2 to tell you whatever you want it to tell you,
as a lot of other verses,
yes,
like in books and
when it comes to structures of church, anyway,
you really can,
because
it's not
5,000 were saved, so there's your mega church. Yay! I've heard, I don't know how many times I've heard that.
Absolutely, and I think the thing to acknowledge is that the Bible does not give what I would call like a specific church model.
Right.
I think there are principles that should be active in every church, but that's my opinion. It doesn't endorse one type, and I don't know that it was meant to.
I think probably why microchurch is coming up, and maybe you could talk about this more, is that church in general in America and in Europe is having trouble getting people who we would categorize as millennials or Gen Zers. Like this younger community of people is not in the church, and so they're looking for other ways, and they think that the micro church is a niche that will welcome, like the millennials will feel comfortable with, the Gen Zers will really enjoy.
Well, yeah, and you think about it, and I mean, and I don't know that the book we read ever said this or anybody ever said this specifically, but it's the truth of the matter is, pragmatically, it's easier to get people today who are a little more skeptical about faith and religion and who are a little like more averse. I mean, they can go listen to sermons even if they're not averse, even if they're like, I love Christianity, they can listen to 20 sermons a day.
Yeah. And
really
Faith
great
Over
ones,
Breakfast podcast to help them.
All that. Yep,
yeah.
Yep. And so their felt need for the church community is just not there. It's not as strong.
Right.
And so but they do want to feel like their life is meaningful and they're doing things that matter and they're having exciting experiences. And so if you provide the on-ramp to church is through getting stuff done that feels meaningful and like it's socially responsible and stuff like that, people are more likely to enter into the church community through that than they are through come and listen to somebody talk about the Bible. I mean, and I think it's uncomfortable to say it that way because that sounds like this is just my new strategy to get people to church.
Right.
But frankly, that probably is a factor. It probably is more interesting for some of those folks to get involved in something like that.
Well, can we talk? Because so here's the focus of at least my experience of church and we've talked about this before, but being trained and being academically capable of teaching Scripture in a way that fits into orthodoxy, and that is very, and maybe 5 levels below, the person sitting out in the community or the audience listening to you. We've trained that really well. We teach Greek and we teach Hebrew and we teach survey and we teach all these different theological ways of understanding Scripture, and we've got that down, and that's been our focus. And then all of a sudden these movements come along where we're saying, well, we can't afford these preachers, so now we got to go bivocational.
Yep.
So
and that's a big factor in all this.
Yeah, so bivocational is a big deal. But I think what's happening too is that society is getting more complex. In fact, I don't know if you watch The Good Place. You ever watched this show on Netflix?
I've heard of it, but no.
You need to watch it.
I know.
I think it should be mandatory for all pastors to watch. But in the 3rd season, and I won't spoil anything, I mean, they're talking about how complex life has gotten over the last 500 years. I mean, this is like a sitcom kind of comedy, but they're wrestling with philosophy and heaven and hell and and the complexity. So they're talking about in one episode, you buy a tomato, and that tomato is like, was picked by a migrant who's paid very little. It's covered in pesticides. And so you make this one choice and it impacts all these people. Like you're promoting all these things and all this complexity. And so my experience is that we have this whole collection of clergy who don't have the capacity to deal with that, because what that does to the human psyche is it begins to break it down, and it doesn't know how to deal with the emotions that it's experiencing. And that doesn't include all the traumatic things that we're kind of just coming to the surface now in our lives. I mean, trauma's been around for a long time, but it's particularly in white American or just American culture. And I think these movements like micro churches, let's just be honest, they're white movements. And like the church, we're talking about white, and I hate to be white again, but it's not the African American community in a big way. Hispanic community is not sitting around talking about how do we work out micro churches. They may have a little bit of a voice in that.
I was going to say there were representative voices at this gathering, and it does seem like those communities might be more, though they wouldn't probably label it and put all the academic stuff on it. Well, maybe they would. I mean,
maybe they might.
There was one guy there who, I mean, his ministry has been basically like they've already written the book on this in a way. They have a whole system for raising up leaders from within the community who are never going to get to like go pay, $50,000 for a seminary education. So they already have all the systems built to raise up local pastors. And I mean, it was pretty impressive. We all went, oh, and it's like, oh, here we are talking about how this could be done, and you guys have been doing it.
Sure.
So
yeah, and I think that exists.
Yeah.
But I still don't think it's the main conversation. They're not getting people together to have a conversation about micro.
They weren't calling it micro church.
No,
they were just calling it.
And they're just doing, if they're doing it, they're
church
just doing it. They're not writing a book about it and trying to sell the book. I mean, for the most part.
No, this guy had all kinds. It was impressive the amount of stuff they have created for their folks, but it was very accessible, and it didn't proclaim out to the whole church, here's the new thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was centered. Sure, I've published 8, 9, 10 books.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that is, but they're not published for anybody but the church, right. This little gathering of people.
Right.
It's just in my experience that when I go to these gatherings, there's a representation of minority communities, but that's not their conversation. At least that's not my experience of their conversation. Tell
me about that.
Well, I think my experience of the conversation in the classes that we exist in, and in, is that they're still they're wrestling with added nuances to life when it comes to oppression and when it comes to trying to even have a voice in the church itself.
Yeah.
I'm just, and I don't want to go off on that one, but I think, they're trying to figure out, especially if you're in the Hispanic community, they're still in a space where they're like, okay, we have people who come in, mom and dad only speak Spanish. Now kids have given up Spanish, and we're trying to go to the same church. They're trying to figure out how to make that transition, to all English services and the conflict there. They're not talking about micro church and we got, 5 people who speak English and 5 who speak Spanish in this house, and we're trying to figure it out. It's mom and dad are upset because kids
they can't go to church together.
Yeah, they can't go to church together. And the African American community, they have so much built into their church services that is communal, and celebratory and long.
So to break that out into like little 5-person missional community churches, so much of that cultural stuff is would be just lost.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't want to go back to my other point though, because here's what I think is, my concern about micro churches is I actually think leaders who are leading these communities need to be paid more. They need to have more space to offer care because the solutions are more complex.
Yeah, one of my concerns in all this, so I'm bivocational and like in many ways all for that. There were some good discussions around all this too. Like one of the things was because this was a denominational group, it's like, how does this microchurch idea, how could this work in a denomination, and what could a denomination offer to something like a really small church community that would be helpful? And one of the things we said was stuff like pay and mentorship and like offering times of retreat and things that, a small micro church can't achieve on its own.
Right.
But yeah, that was one of the things. I didn't really go there. The meeting, there were a lot of exciting conversations about ventures that you could do to fund your churches, your little churches, and all this stuff, and how to collaborate with people in the marketplace, and that's all very exciting. But one of the things that has been on my mind since, I think one of the problems I've had as a pastor who is bivocational and doing all this stuff, is it's hard to just like slow down and just sit with Jesus.
Right.
That's hard. And people need someone like who it does have that, who's inviting them into that, right? And who is doing that by experience. But I think they also need to know that the person doing that can relate. So that's where having like another job isn't the worst thing.
It's not the worst thing.
But then I was just going to say the other side is, that you just, one of the struggles I've had is that the bivocationalism has made it hard to slow down and be with people in their time of need.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if you look at scripture, the elders in the early church, if we're going to go back to the early church, eventually said, we can't do everything.
Yeah.
We need to be people who are praying, who are studying scripture, and who are actually going, like pouring into people's lives. Right. So we need to get a secondary group of people, of which every church calls deacons, to kind of relieve some of the everyday work that we're doing.
So the interesting, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things that Nick and I came away with is we kind of said, we're not necessarily 100% sure about that we would spin off things that we called microchurches, but we actually thought, I wonder if like to us this sounded like deacons and people who followed after, like groups of people that had a specific ministry that they thought was very critical, that the church empowered them to do and helped fund, and that they went and gathered people and did it. You know, we actually had that conversation where we said, that sounds like maybe like what a really great group of deacons would do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. When I think about the micro church, like a lot of times they connect things to family.
Yeah.
And so they say, oh, well, you know, families are small and families do grow and they multiply. And what they forget is that families take forever to grow. But I think what they're right about is that a family that has a mission sticks together and does its mission. Like mom, dad, kids, like they understand that they're all doing the same thing and they're doing it together. Whereas you can have a very stagnant family or a family that's separated from itself because they're all existing together.
But they all have different goals.
They have different goals. And so, I think you can spin off these communities, and if they're not missionally oriented, meaning they have a mission, then they're just going to be stagnant, and it's going to, take a while. It's not going to grow. Yeah. It's just going to be a little clique in a house.
Yeah, and I think that's what the critique of some of the home churches was that it became that. And so with the micro church movement, they're talking about networks so that you don't just become a little clique and you come together. And some of them are talking about larger gatherings for worship with all of their micro churches and stuff. And, which is where, again, Nick and I went, well, that you're calling the network the thing that we might just call the church, and you're calling the elders what we might call the deacons. Like, so it's feels more like a shuffling of terms sometimes than
right. I mean,
which can confuse people.
I guess it does. It's one good thing is it's looking to empower people on the ground.
That's what I came away with, was what I think that church in Tampa, the underground, what I think they keyed into that a lot of us are missing is they empowered people to do ministry that they believed in. They gave them titles, they commissioned them, they support them. And I think that is needed and is exciting for people. And I think we often, because of the whole professional clergy thing, it's like the big church, we run it, and if you have an idea, you let us know and we'll decide if we're going to do it or not. And their model, which I do respect that, they went, you have an idea, and not just like, go do it. Oh, good idea, go do it. They were like, you have an idea. We're going to investigate that a little bit, and if we really affirm that this is from God, we're going to give you a title and a commission, and we're going to get some of our resources behind you so you can go do this. And I think that is a good idea, I think.
Right.
I walked away thinking, I think something they're bringing to the table is that we do need to be more like that.
Right. My thing about all of that is you have to have a culture, especially if you do like a church like ours, where you're going to say, but that can be closed down at any time. Right. Like that things don't last forever. So we're not going to give you a title and then you're like, the coordinating person who's running forever and ever. It's just for right now, we're going to empower this and see what God does with it. But it may move on, and that's okay. Yeah. And you might move on, and your mission may change, and we're good with that.
This church in Tampa, they like their micro church leaders re-up every year, and they kind of look at the whole like mission of the church, and are we still is that still what we want to do? And I think they look at the mission of their micro church, and they decide am I doing this again this year? And so they've even apparently recognized some need for reassessment.
Here's my thing is like a lot of these churches I hear that they are younger for the most part, and they don't have kids. Yeah, there are some that there are children involved in it, but my experience
that does change things
because I've been in this for 20 years, and in the beginning we didn't have any kids but my own.
And everybody was just excited to just do cool stuff.
You could do cool stuff. You could stay up till, whatever hours. You can go do mission. But children change it. And if you don't continue to create a culture of, hey, everybody's in it together, including the littlest to the oldest. Yeah. And we're not programmizing things. We're not going to all of a sudden, we have 15 teenagers, so we're having a youth group.
Right.
Now, those 15 teenagers, we have got to figure out how to integrate them to what we're doing now.
Yeah.
So and what is their mission, and how do we empower them in their mission to do. And that doesn't mean peer-oriented things are not good, but we're not going to have a youth group that then we're trying to hire a youth leader for. Then we're trying to maintain to get more kids to be in the youth group.
Yeah, because now you got to pay this guy's salary.
No, we're not doing that kind of thing. We have to say, no, you at 13, you at 14, you at 17, you fit here. Your mission fits here. We're here to empower you. You belong to us. We belong to you. You know, there isn't a limit on what you can do. You can be part of the same discipleship process as everybody else and step into the world of mission. So I think that's the danger. And it will be interesting to see. I think micro churches and small churches, they come and go, and their iterations are going to be different.
All these every time that's like there's a new name and there's a new thing, I tend to figure it's a piece of the journey, but at the end of the day, there is the church of Jesus Christ. And I expect all these things to kind of have their ups and downs, and most of them we'll forget. I don't think someday we're going to go, micro church was it. Wow. That actually is the only thing that lasted. I assume it'll all come and go, but that the Church of Jesus Christ itself will not. And so, I tend to take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Well, and I think that philosophically, like when I read Acts, I think Tim Keller, who has a big church, says this really well. He says, any church, you can't make the Holy Spirit come on you to have a revival. You can't have a movement that, wow, this is it, and the Holy Spirit is on it, and he's going to, make it really big. You can just prepare yourself by being obedient and disciplining yourself to be in submission to Christ. And then when the Spirit blows, you'll be ready. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if you have a mega church, if you got a little church like yours and mine, if you got the micro church network, or you're one little group of guys and girls in a house somewhere praying fervently for God to do something. You need to submit yourself into Matthew 28, to the process of holiness, and the Spirit will move. Some
of these like micro churches, they might actually end up being really intriguing, and they become actually quite large and not very micro at all, right?
Right.
And some of the larger ideas as we've seen, and I'm sure talked to people, have turned out to not be so large and small actually. And then it becomes more about, am I going to walk with Jesus in what he does here? Whatever it is.
And I think the thing is that we're unique people. Yeah. And God's creativity, is pouring out. So it's micro church, or, we've had numbers of people come to our church just because I put a silly title out there one day, it's a neo-monastic mega house church. And people come because they're like, I really am interested in what the heck
that is.
Well, it's just a name, and maybe it starts a movement. Maybe it doesn't start a movement. There's your church is mission. Well, that's very Catholic. Right. I mean,
it's either really Catholic or really missional. Which no Catholic would ever say.
Yeah.
But it just depends on where you're coming from, right? If your background is Catholicism, or you assume that's what it is.
Right.
If you've been part of the missional church discussions of the past few years, you assume that's what it is.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well.
So I guess our conclusion is about this micro church is that Jesus is really important.
Yep.
At the center of whatever you're doing.
Follow Jesus. I actually do. I need to run, Eric.
All right.
I've got another thing a little bit sooner than I usually do on Tuesday, but thanks for hanging out.